The knock came at a time when the world was supposed to be asleep, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath between gusts, and Eli Granger, widowed rancher of the High Plains, woke with a start as though the sound had struck his chest instead of his door, his eyes snapping open to the dark rafters above his bed while the memory of another, knock older, crueler, flickered through his mind like a dying flame. The night his wife had bled out beneath these same beams, with no help coming and no lanterns lit, only his useless prayers echoing into silence. Outside, rain whispered against the windows, soft but relentless, and the moon hid behind heavy clouds, turning the ranch into a black shape swallowed by prairie and sky. The knock came again, smaller this time, hesitant, as if whoever stood on his porch might disappear if they weren't careful enough. And Eli swung his legs over the side of the bed, joints aching, heart already hardening with the reflex of loss, because nothing good ever arrived at a man's door after midnight. He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his coat, and took the lantern from the hook by the stairs, lighting it with a practiced hand even as his jaw clenched, because light had once failed him, and he had sworn never to trust it again. When he opened the door, the storm pushed in first, cold and damp, and then he saw her, a little girl no older than 7, soaked through, hair plastered to her face, bare feet red and trembling on the porch boards, her hands knotted into the front of a too thin dress as if holding herself, together by force of will alone. She looked up at him with eyes far too steady for a child, eyes that had already learned what fear tasted like. "Mister," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain. "Mama needs help." Eli felt something crack in his chest, sharp and unwanted, and he nearly shut the door on it, nearly told himself that other people's desperation was a fire that burned men like him down to ash. But then the girl swayed just a little, and he saw dried blood on her sleeve, dark against the faded fabric, and the words she didn't say, "we have no one else," hung between them, heavier than thunder. He stepped back and lifted the lantern higher, letting its warm glow spill over her small, shaking frame, and in that light he saw not a threat to his solitude, but a plea so raw it cut through years of self-imposed isolation. "Where is she?" he asked, and the girl pointed into the darkness beyond the gate, toward the low hills where broken homesteads crouched like wounded animals, and said, "The old Miller cabin. She can't get up anymore. I tried." That was when Eli noticed how the child's hands were scraped and swollen, how her knees bore fresh cuts, how exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, and something ancient and stubborn stirred in him. The man he had been before grief taught him to close his doors. He didn't argue, didn't ask questions, didn't let himself think about how far the cabin was or how dangerous the storm had become. Instead, he turned and began lighting lantern after lantern along the porch rail, along the fence posts, along the path that led from his house toward the barns, the soft gold flames blooming one by one in the dark, like a quiet army of stars called down to earth. The girl watched with wide eyes as the ranch transformed from a place of shadows into a corridor of light, and when she whispered, "That's a lot of lanterns," Eli answered without looking at her. No one should have to walk alone tonight, the words surprising even him. He wrapped her in his spare coat, lifted her easily despite how light she was, and carried her to the barn where his horse waited, old Samson snorting softly as if sensing urgency. And as Eli swung into the saddle with the child held close against his chest, rain slicking his hat brim and lantern swinging from the saddle horn, he felt the weight of a promise settle over him, heavy and irrevocable. They rode fast, the lantern light carving a trembling tunnel through the rain, and the girl told him her name was Clara, and her mama's name was Ruth, and her papa had died last winter, and the baby was crying, but now too quiet. And with every word Eli's grip tightened, because he knew the sound of a baby, gone too quiet, and the shape of a woman's pain when help came too late. When the cabin finally emerged from the storm, sagging and dark, Eli dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, lifting Clara down and pushing the door open with his shoulder, and the smell of sickness and cold rushed out to meet him like a wall. Inside, a woman lay on a thin mattress by the hearth, her skin ashen, lips cracked, eyes fluttering open only long enough to register the light before slipping closed again. And a bundled infant lay beside her, too still, too pale, and Eli dropped to his knees, lantern casting long, shaking shadows across the walls as the past threatened to drag him under. But he stayed, because this time there was a knock that had been answered, a child who had walked through the storm, and a choice that would define what kind of man he would be when the lanterns burned down to nothing. Eli moved with a speed that surprised even him, as though his body remembered what his heart had tried to forget, setting the lantern down near the hearth and coaxing the weak embers into life until the room breathed with a little warmth, then shrugging off his coat to wrap it around the woman's shoulders while Clara hovered close, silent now, her eyes tracking every motion as if afraid the light itself might flee if she blinked. Ruth's breathing was shallow and uneven, each rise of her chest a fragile bargain with the night, and when Eli pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, he felt a pulse that wavered like a flame in a draft. Not gone, but dangerously close, and the memory of his wife's last breaths clawed up his spine, the helpless waiting, the counting, the prayers that had come too late. He swallowed hard and pushed the memory down because there was no room for ghosts here, not tonight. The baby stirred at last, a thin, reedy cry slipping from its lips, and Clara let out a sound halfway between relief and fear, kneeling beside the bundle as if guarding it with her small body, while Eli checked the infant's skin and frowned at the cold of it, already calculating what little he could do with what the cabin offered. Water. Rags heat time. He sent Clara to fetch snow-melt water from the pot by the door, speaking gently but firmly, and she obeyed at once, moving with the practiced obedience of a child who had learned early that hesitation could cost more than comfort. As he worked, Eli noticed the signs Ruth herself would never have named: the infected gash hidden beneath her torn skirt, the fever that had burned unchecked, the exhaustion of a woman who had given everything she had until there was nothing left to spend, and he felt anger flare hot and sharp, not at her, but at a world that let women bleed in cabins while men slept safe, behind locked doors. When Ruth's eyes fluttered open again, she tried to sit up, panic flooding her face until she saw Clara and then Eli, the lantern light framing him like something out of a story she no longer believed in, and she whispered, "Please, don't take her," the words tumbling out with the last of her strength, and Eli answered quietly, "I'm not here to take anything. I'm here to help," though he wasn't entirely sure what help would look like yet. He cleaned the wound as best he could, the woman gasping and crying out once before slipping into a fevered half-sleep. And when the baby's cries grew stronger, he felt a fragile thread of hope tighten in his chest, because sound meant life, and life meant there was still time to fight. Outside, the storm worsened, rain turning to sleet that rattled against the cabin walls, and Eli stood listening, knowing the ride back to his ranch would be long and dangerous, but knowing also that staying here through the night would be a gamble he wasn't willing to lose. He told Clara they would move her mama somewhere warm and safe, somewhere with real walls and food and light, and Clara nodded without hesitation, trusting him with the fierce, absolute faith only a child with no other options could give. They bundled Ruth carefully, Eli lifting her with an ease born of ranch work and necessity, the lantern swinging again as he carried her out into the storm, while Clara cradled the baby close, whispering promises she barely understood, but clung to all the same. The ride back was slow and treacherous, Eli guiding Samson by instinct, more than sight, as the lanterns he had lit earlier glimmered in the distance like a promise. He was determined not to break, and when they finally reached the ranch, he saw the light he had left burning in his window, and felt something unfamiliar settle over him, not dread, not grief, but responsibility, heavy and steady as a hand on his shoulder. He carried Ruth inside and laid her on his own bed without a second thought, feeding the fire until the room glowed bright and warm, and as Clara stood in the doorway clutching her baby, looking smaller than ever against the wide wooden walls, Eli realized that the lanterns he had lit were no longer just guiding them through the dark. They were calling him back to a life he had buried with his wife, a life where doors opened and help came when it was needed. Morning did not come gently to the Granger ranch. It crept in on bruised clouds and pale light, the storm finally spent but leaving behind a silence so thick it rang in Eli's ears as he stood at the stove stirring broth, the smell of it filling the house in a way it hadn't since the year his wife died, when meals were cooked for 2, and Hope still sat at the table uninvited. Ruth had survived the night, though just barely, her fever breaking in waves that left her soaked and trembling, and Eli had not slept at all, sitting by the bed with his sleeves rolled up, wiping her brow, counting breaths, and listening to the soft, steady sounds of 2 children breathing in the next room. Clara curled on the floor beside the baby's basket like a faithful guard, dog who refused to leave her post. When Ruth stirred again, her eyes clearer now, she looked around the room as if expecting the walls to vanish, disbelief etched into every line of her face. And when she saw Eli, she tried to speak but stopped, swallowing back tears that fell anyway, silent and hot, until he handed her a cup and said simply, "You're safe. Drink slow." She obeyed. And that obedience felt like a fragile contract between them. One built on trust neither had planned to give. Clara woke to the smell of food and padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. And when Eli placed a bowl in her hands, she stared at it as if it were a miracle, then ate with careful slowness, saving some without being told, her eyes flicking toward the basket where her baby sibling slept, and that small, unthinking act did something to Eli's chest that no amount of grief ever had. He cleaned his house as if preparing for judgment, opening windows, changing linens, stacking firewood higher than necessary, because keeping his hands busy was the only way to keep the questions at bay. How long they would stay, what would happen when Ruth recovered, what it would cost him to care when he had sworn never to do so again. Word of the midnight lights traveled faster than he expected. By noon, a neighbor rode by slow, tipping his hat and glancing toward the house with open curiosity, and Eli felt the old walls rise inside him, the instinct to protect what was his by pushing the world away, except now what was his included a fevered woman and 2 children who had nowhere else to go. Ruth asked, her voice stronger now but still edged with fear. How she could repay him, and Eli answered honestly, by getting well, because the truth was he did not know how to ask for anything else. When Clara ventured outside and counted the lantern hooks still, hanging along the fence, she came back wide-eyed and asked why he had lit so many just for her. And Eli paused, then said, because one light can be missed? A lesson he had learned too late once and would not repeat. As the sun climbed higher, Ruth finally told him the rest of her story. The debts, the illness, the neighbors who meant well but were stretched thin, the long nights when she had prayed for anything to change, and Eli listened without interruption, because listening was its own kind of work, and when she finished, he made no promises except the only one that mattered. You won't be sent away today. The words settled into the room like something solid, something that could be built on, and for the first time since his wife's death, Eli Granger felt the quiet shift of his life's direction, subtle but unmistakable, as if the lanterns he had lit in the dark were still burning inside him, guiding him forward into a future he had never planned, but was no longer afraid to face. The ranch woke fully to its new reality the following days, not with drama or declarations, but with the steady accumulation of small moments that stitched themselves into something resembling a family, though none of them dared to name it yet, and Eli found himself measuring time not by the sun's arc over the pasture, but by Ruth's breaths growing deeper, the baby's cries turning stronger, and Clara's footsteps moving more confidently through rooms that had once echoed with emptiness. Ruth's recovery was uneven, marked by setbacks that sent fear spiking through Eli's chest when her fever returned in the evenings, but each morning she rose a little stronger, insisting on sitting up, then standing, then helping in whatever small ways she could, her pride warring constantly with her gratitude, and Eli learned to accept both without comment, because survival had taught him that dignity mattered almost as much as kindness. Clara became his shadow, following him to the barn, asking careful questions about the horses and the land, absorbing every answer with an intensity that reminded him painfully of himself as a boy before. Loss had hardened his edges, and when she laughed, soft at first, then full and unguarded, it startled him every time, like a sound from a forgotten language returning to his ears. Not everyone approved of their arrangement, and Eli sensed it long before it was spoken aloud, in the way riders slowed when passing the ranch, in the glances that lingered too long, in the murmured speculations carried on the wind from town, because a widowed man living alone was one thing, but a woman and children under his roof without a ring or a clear explanation made people uneasy, and unease had a way of sharpening into judgment when left unattended. The first confrontation came on a gray afternoon when Sheriff Dalton rode up unannounced, his expression polite but guarded, his eyes scanning the yard before settling on Eli with a look that said he'd come to ask questions he already thought he knew the answers to. Eli met him halfway, shoulders squared, the weight of every lantern-lit choice heavy in his stance, and when Dalton asked about the woman and children, Eli told the truth without embellishment, because lies would only invite more trouble, and the truth of sickness, desperation, and a child's midnight courage sat between them like a challenge. The sheriff listened, nodded once, and said there would be talk, because there was always talk, but also said that no law had been broken by saving lives, and as he rode away, Eli knew the real battle would not be fought in courtrooms or cells, but in the quiet resolve to keep his door open even when the world pushed back. Ruth watched the exchange from the window, her face pale, fear flickering in her eyes when she asked if she should leave to spare him trouble, and Eli answered without hesitation, "No," the firmness in his voice surprising them both, because the truth was he had already decided, somewhere between the lanterns and the long night, that some troubles were worth carrying. That evening, as the sun bled red over the plains and Clara rocked the baby by the fire, Eli felt the fragile shape of hope take root deeper than he expected. Even as he sensed darker challenges gathering beyond the horizon, drawn inevitably toward the light he had dared to ignition, trouble did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like cold through the seams of a winter coat, and Eli felt it in the way townfolk spoke his name with careful politeness, in the way conversation stopped when he entered the general store, and in the way Ruth flinched whenever a rider approached the ranch, fear rising in her eyes as if she expected the world to reclaim its due. The first real blow came when a man named Harlan Pike rode up with papers clenched in his fist and resentment carved deep into his face, claiming the Miller cabin land Ruth had been living on was overdue on taxes and now legally his. And though the cabin was empty, his gaze lingered on Ruth and the children with an implication that made Eli's hands curl into fists. Words were exchanged, sharp and edged, and Eli stood his ground, refusing to let the threat pass quietly. But he knew men like Pike didn't need permission to cause harm. They only needed time and opportunity. That night, a lantern along the fence was smashed, glass scattered in the dirt like broken stars, and Clara found it at dawn, her face tight with worry as she carried the ruined frame to Eli, asking in a small voice if the light had done something wrong. Eli knelt in the dust and told her no, that sometimes people feared light because it showed things they wanted to keep hidden, and he fixed the lantern and rehung it higher than before, letting its glow stretch even farther across the land. Ruth tried again to leave, convinced she was the cause of the hostility, but Eli finally spoke the truth he had been holding back, telling her about his wife, about the night no one came, about the promise he had made to himself never to turn away a knock born of need, and Ruth listened with tears tracking down her cheeks, understanding at last that this was not charity but a vow, stitched into the fabric of who he was. The tension in town grew bolder after that, whispers turning into warnings, and when Clara was mocked by older children for stealing a rancher, Eli's restraint cracked just enough for him to visit their parents and make it clear that cruelty toward a child would not be tolerated, his calm presence more frightening than any raised voice. Still, fear pressed in from all sides, and one night it finally took shape when smoke curled low over the pasture and Eli woke to the sharp scent of burning wood, racing outside to find the hay barn ablaze, flames clawing at the sky in a vicious echo of the night he had once lost everything. He fought the fire with ruthless determination, the ranch hands and a few neighbors joining in when they saw the glow, and as dawn broke, the barn stood blackened but standing, the worst damage spared by grit and luck. No one confessed, but no one needed to. The message had been sent. Ruth stood beside Eli in the ash-streaked morning, her hand trembling as it slipped into his, and this time he did not pull away, because the world had drawn its line and he had chosen which side of it he would stand on, lanterns lit and unextinguished, ready to face whatever darkness dared to come next.